Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Fine. Nods of heads, fine. Nobody nodded their head. Thank you for nodding your head. I appreciate it. My name is Benedict, and I work for Interculture International Student Services. I'm a student assistant there. I'm also a senior. So a few things before we begin our session with Professor Charles Wright. I have to mention our sponsors, which are Academic Affairs, CSB Campus Ministry, CSB Sustainability Office, CSB SJU Libraries, Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement, Fine Arts Programming, Intercultural International Student Services, Joint Events Council, College and Catholic Thought and Culture, Mathematics Department, PRISM, Reflection Action Dialogue, St. John's University School of Theology, and SJU Theology on Tap. I also encourage you to visit any other sessions happening this week. They are full of information and education and just riveting. Today we'll be hearing from Professor Charles Wright, getting in touch with your inner races. And I want you to know that next week, evaluations will be coming out on all of the presentations this week. I implore you to fill those out. Have a great time. Thank you. Please welcome Professor Charles Wright.
All right, can you hear me? Do I need this thing, or can you hear me in the back? You can hear me? All right. I will not work well with this. So a lot of my colleagues, when they're doing the teachings, they're doing scholarly stuff, history, cultural studies, communication, stuff like this. Mine's a lot more personal. As you know, the title really does capture it. What I'm up to today, here's what I'm wanting to show, is I'm going to try to illuminate how beliefs about the inferiority of people of color continue to shape white people's thoughts and attitudes without us being aware of it. And then how I discovered that about myself. So this is, if you want a category to put this in, if you want a concept, you can call it, it's about implicit racism. And some of you may be familiar with implicit racist tests, but I don't need to take that test to know what my attitudes are because I discovered them in other ways. And that's what I want to share with you. So here's my thesis. I think that racial equity in the United States will remain elusive until people, especially white people, but not just white people, but especially white people, are willing to be honest about our racial prejudices that we didn't choose, but that we share, and for which we're responsible. Right? So there's lots of ways we can understand racism. Right? One is a person or a group of people who deliberately, consciously, and explicitly believe that one race is superior, that others are inferior, that members of the superior race deserve more opportunities, and so forth. We can call that deliberate racism. That's with us still. But that's not what I'm talking about. There's a person who habitually treats some people with more respect, consideration, and fairness than others because of their race. We might call it habitual racism. Don't think about it. Don't intend necessarily harm, but it's still the way we behave. That seems to me to be something that's similar to implicit racism, but it's not exactly what I'm getting at. And then there's structural racism, right? A system of laws, rules of behavior, institutional requirements, and cultural norms that benefit one racial group while systematically excluding others from that benefit. We call that structural racism. If you study sociology, you'll learn about that. That's not what I'm talking about either, though it's certainly connected. And now here's the difficulty that white folks face when we're addressing this kind of issue of implicit racism. Right? Racist and racism are typically used as terms of moral condemnation. Right? It means that the person's morally corrupt. And it's also human nature, something that social scientists, social psychologists in particular, have documented, as thoroughly as anything can be documented, is that every individual wants to believe good of themselves. They want to think, I'm a good person. Right? And so if you've got this term, racism, that's a term of moral condemnation, and you use it to label a person, that person's reaction is naturally going to be defensive. Right? That's just the way, particularly we white people, that's the way we do it. So to be labeled racist means that someone's supposed to be bad, and we just don't want to accept that about ourselves. I mean, how many people do you know who actually will come right out and say, yeah, I'm just a bad person, an evil person. I do harm. Right? So white people who reject deliberate and habitual racism, who do their best to treat people of all races equitably, we typically reject the idea that we're racist. But well-meaning white folks, we typically overlook the idea of implicit racism, not the idea of the reality, right? So, what does that mean, broadly defined? Refers to, I don't like that word utilization there, just that we, have act upon, think in terms of, find ourselves reacting in relation to unconscious biases when making about judgments about people from different racial and ethnic groups. And according to a number of researchers, this is an automatic, it could be understood as an automatic negative reaction to someone from a different race or ethnicity than one's own. Here's an example of how implicit racism works. Tamika Cross was a physician. She was OBGYN, and she was on a Delta Airlines flight. This happened in 2016, so it's a couple years old. And the person just a couple seats in front of her started having heart trouble, right? And there was a request put out for a physician on the aircraft to help with this person, and she's a physician. She offers to help. The flight attendant tells her to sit down. Why? She can't imagine that a black woman is a physician, right? So they finally dig up somebody who doesn't have the same credentials that she has, doesn't have the same ability, and is actually retired. And they ask this old white guy, who's really not as ready to help as she is, to do the work, right? And when this was publicized, there were on chat rooms and listservs, there were just endless stories of people of color who were in the medical profession who had the same kind of story to tell over and over and over again. White people couldn't believe that they were actually competent medical trained personnel, right? And they didn't, it wasn't like they were deliberately trying to harm anybody, put anybody down. It's just like it didn't enter their heads. That's implicit racism at work. Okay, so here's a potentially controversial premise, controversial because some people want to deny it. I don't know how y'all feel about it, but we have not escaped fully overcome or freed ourselves from the racist history of the nation. So the idea that white people are superior, it still colors. And not just white people. It shapes the culture as a whole, right? Influences the cultural beliefs and attitudes of U.S. Americans, all U.S. Americans, even Latino folks, even Asian folks, even African Americans. And here's an example that really painfully illustrates this. Let me see if I can do this without messing things up. Some of you may be familiar with the black doll, white doll test.
In Brown versus Board of Education, the famous case of desegregated schools in the 1950s, Dr. Kenneth Clark conducted a doll test with black children. He asked them to choose between a black doll and a white doll. In most instances, the majority of the children preferred the white doll. I decided to reconduct this test as Dr. Clark did to see how we've progressed since then. Can you show me the doll that you like best or that you'd like to play with?
This one. I like that one.
Okay.
This one.
That one?
I like to play with this.
And can you show me the doll that is the nice doll? And why is that the nice doll?
She's white.
And can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. And and why does that look bad?
Because it's black.
And why do you think that's a nice doll?
Because she's white.
And can you give me the doll that looks like you? "15 out of the 21 children preferred the white doll.
Okay. Let's see if I can stop this quickly. Probably a better way to do this, but I'm not very good with this technological stuff. Okay, so that's the premise. Even African Americans. We'll come back to that. Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? We'll come back to that. Okay? So, people's unconscious, implicit, intuitive beliefs and preferences are shaped by our cultural environments. That's uncontroversial. That's social science 101. If the environment is racist, and I'm suggesting that it is, then the only reasonable perspective, and then people's unconscious, implicit, intuitive beliefs and preferences will also be racist. We don't choose it. That's the way it turns out. So I could, if I wanted, I could claim, okay, look, I'm not racist. I've learned through my life, through various kinds of experiences and training, to be genuinely impartial, even-handed in my attitudes towards people of color versus white people and whatnot, right? So I went to an integrated elementary school for a number of years, right? I had some of my friends there were African-American kids. My parents teaching an example. My mother taught in a low-income majority black school district for many years. My experience with high school athletics, really integrated. It was an integrated high school, integrated team, reasonably impartial coaches. My major advisor in college was an African-American man. And this could go on from there, right? But here's how I discovered that despite I could claim not to be a racist, not to have these implicit biases in myself, right? But here's how I discovered that actually they were there. Okay? So first one was in a graduate ethics class led by a fellow student, Leslie Jubilee, an African-American woman. And let me give you the background first, right? You need background to see this in yourself. So this is from the 19th century. This is 19th century science, right? This is the science saying people of African descent are not fully human, right? You see at the top, that's the model of the white person. That's the fully human being. And then at the bottom, we see an orangutan, one of the great apes. And we see in between, that's supposed to be a person of African descent. They're not quite human. Not an ape either, halfway between, right? And you see another example with this illustration here, right? All the different apes, and then we put an African person there, same posture, same position, and so on and so forth. This is science in the 19th century. Now, these ideas we can find today if we go looking for them, right? I just hunted around a little bit on the web, and you can find this stuff with us now, right? So we've got, this is apparently some famous sports figure. I don't know who it is, but whoever done the likeness created that little comparison between him and a gorilla. Or you can find when Obama was in office. This helps to explain why some people got so angry about Obama being in office, right? This is their way of expressing it. Just another kind of half human. Okay, so we find that's the historical background that people of African descent were more ape-like than human. And I discovered that in myself because when we were having a conversation, Leslie Jubilee, now Professor Jubilee, was making a presentation on certain ethical issues and perspectives within the African American community, and I don't know how it got into my brain, but somehow it seemed relevant. That there were threats that gorillas were facing in the forests of the Congo that were comparable or meaningfully analogous to the situation she was describing in the African American community. And at the moment, I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea that this history was just like coming right through me into my words. I only understood that maybe something wasn't quite right when Leslie at a certain point says, I have to interrupt before I explode. She said it like a person who was not ready to explode. I was amazed at her. In hindsight, it's like, oh man, that was self-control. It was only a few hours later that I realized what I had just done. Right? And then I saw it. Oh, that stuff lives in me. That stuff is me. Okay? So that's one example. Here's another one, martial arts street combat fantasies. I've been a practitioner of a Japanese martial art called Aikido for a little over 30 years. And like many young men who take up martial art, we're anxious about our masculinity, anxious about whether we can protect ourselves against other people's aggression, whether we might be able to use our martial arts to protect other people against other people's aggression. And of course, when I go in these sort of like daydreams and reveries, I imagine things like that, right? I would imagine that I was in a situation where there was some kind of a criminal perpetrator about to do violence to me or somebody else, and I would use these techniques to protect myself and protect other people. And then I realized, I noticed on one occasion, oh my goodness, all the criminal perpetrators characters who appear in my mind are black men. Now, where'd that come from? Well, there is a long history of associating black men with criminality. It goes back to just after the Civil War, because before the Civil War, the way Africans, Americans, people of African descent were presented when they were slaves was that, well, really, they were happy this way, right? Because since they're not fully human, since they're actually a little bit more like animals, if we take proper care of them, just like we take proper care of our horses and our cows, they'll be happy. And that was the way they were presented in writing, in literature, in images, that they were happy being slaves. But then the war was fought, and there was Reconstruction, and suddenly you had free black people, and that scared the hell out of white people. And so, after Reconstruction, the image of the criminal black man started. There wasn't happy black people anymore. It was dangerous black people. And this takes all sorts of forms now. Like, I just hunted up a little bit of research that shows that even though, in reality, African American males and white males are, on average, the same size, when people are presented with just images of African American faces, they imagine that these men are much larger than they actually are, and they project aggression and dangerous qualities onto them. That's just one example. What do people, with their minds, what do they project onto these images? That's one example. The list could go on and on and on. So that's the second way I discovered my inner racist, right? I thought black men were criminals. They were the ones who I was going to have to use my martial arts skills against. Okay, here's the other one. This is the one that really bothers me because I still struggle with it. I struggle with it in the most personal way. Even now, I have an initial doubting reaction to black professionals, right? A small prick of fear that a black person really can't be a fully competent doctor or lawyer or professor. I even think that about my college advisor, Lucius Alba. I don't choose that, but that's my gut reaction. You can't be as good philosophers, these other white people whose stuff I read that pay so much attention to, right? So it's like I've got two reels. I've got one reel going on one part of my brain, and it's just spooling out the imagery that I have inherited, the imagery, the biases that I have inherited by virtue of being socialized within this nation. And then I've got another reel that I have to get spinning to try to correct for that, right? To maintain that awareness. Right? So this is my takeaway from this, right? White folks who are sincerely opposed to racism, we have a special responsibility to become acquainted with the racist beliefs and attitudes we have inherited from our history and our culture. And then, as I like to say, that dwell in our imagination. Okay? It's there. If you go looking, you will find it. Right? We're shocked that. Right? We didn't choose these beliefs and attitudes, but we're still responsible for them because they will affect our behavior if we're not aware. Okay? So, in this case, being racist doesn't mean moral corruption or failure. It simply means recognizing an uncomfortable reality. Right? Being responsible for implicit racism means being mindful, paying attention, engaging in constant self-examination, and acknowledging unwelcome truths about ourselves. That's like a starting point. That's not where we finish, but that's a starting point. And so, we white folks have got a special responsibility to practice this self-awareness and honesty because for centuries we have been and we still are beneficiaries of a system of racial oppression because it's still up and running. As long as we're walking around with all of these implicit biases in us, and it's millions of us, and we're just carrying on our everyday lives, how's that not going to have a harmful effect on people of color around us? How's it not? It cannot but have that kind of effect, right? So we are the beneficiaries, and we white folks have a special responsibility for this, to develop this kind of awareness. And this is my thesis again, until white folks who are sincerely opposed to racial inequity are ready to engage in this kind of self-reflection and acknowledge these kinds of unpleasant truths about ourselves, I don't think it'll be possible to make a whole lot of progress. We'll just keep spinning our wheels, right? Because if we're not aware, and then try to do something about what we discover about ourselves, then we're just going to keep reenacting the same scripts over and over and over again. So, and this is a quote from Martin Luther King, one of the lesser known quotes from the letter from Birmingham jail, right? Where a shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding of people from ill will. Okay, that's what I have for you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
When you notice these things, like when you encounter a Black professional and notice that you have this initial reaction of self-doubt, how do you actively work against that?
That's a good question. In a certain sense, you just have to go forward and just trust your own distrust, right? And have faith. That's all I can say about it, right? You know, because what's your other option? You know, you could not cooperate, you could leave. It's like, oh no, you're not my doctor. I'm going to go find something else. That's, you know, that's all you can do is be aware. And it's like, it's you find yourself dwelling in a really uncomfortable place. And the question is what do you do with that discomfort? Do you flee it, or do you try to understand it? Yes, ma'am.
So CSB, I'm actually a predominantly white institution, and do you teach as part of your?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm in the faculty.
So if you recognize your biases in the classroom, being like rather than being aware, how do you I guess like work to be equitable towards all students who are in your class?
One way is for any serious grading, I don't want to know whose work it is, right? I try to make sure any kind of major project I'm scoring is anonymous. That's one way to try to control for that. In the classroom itself, you know, it's like, here's what happens. When I fuck up, I apologize. I acknowledge it there in public. Describe it for what it is and apologize. I mean, I would say I'm mindful, right? One of the ways that implicit bias will show itself. All right, I'll share this story with you. Tell my daughter out of this little serious trouble at school. She had a substitute teacher. She believed that she was observing some implicit bias in his own work, right? This teacher, when, let's see, okay, so what were the things he was doing? When he saw a white student with the handheld device out at a time that was not supposed to be out of class, he would first give that student a warning, maybe sometimes two, before confiscating it. Whereas with the students of color, he would just immediately confiscate it. And then she observed that he would consistently call on the white students before he needed to call on the students of color. And she observed that when they were working at their desks and they were raising their hands asking for assistance, he would approach the white students who asked for help. But the students of color, he would tell them to come to the front of the class to talk with her. So she tried to bring this to the attention of the administration and it really created quite a fuss. The reason I use that example is that I try to be mindful of that kind of stuff all the time, right? The propensity, you know, you've got a conversation going, who do I call on? Do I recognize somebody as contributing too much and needing to be silenced? Who is that, right? There's any number of different factors where I just constantly have to monitor myself. And if I'm not sure that I have done something inappropriate, I'll ask the student after class. But if I'm real confident that what I did was you know, I messed up, then I will apologize at that point. So that's about what I can say as far as that goes. I'm not sure that's enough, but that's what I do. Yes, sir.
Did you have these attitudes toward all minorities or just like darker skin?
That's a real good question. I think I'm subject to the same model minority bias as a lot of people when it comes to Asians. Though that's been made a lot more complex because both my kids are adopted from Korea, and so that adds a whole other layer of complexity to it. But I think I don't have much experience interacting with Latino people, but I strongly suspect I would have those kinds of biases there, just as much as with African Americans, from a different historical background for different reasons. But that we have cultural biases about Latinos, Hispanics, Puerto Ricans, especially if you spent time on the East Coast, where I did my higher education on the East Coast. You can't avoid biases about them as well. Many of the same kinds of things. Did that answer your question? Anybody else? All right, well, this isn't a classroom. Oh, yes, ma'am, yes.
Sorry, one question. I guess my question is like, how do you encourage people who have privilege to become uncomfortable because you live in comfort, so why don't you change the status quo when you benefit?
Yeah. You have to be motivated by a concern for the truth and for justice, really. That's the only thing, is do you care about justice? What are the principles? What are the principles of justice that the nation claims to be founded on? And then to look at the incompatibility, the tension between these principles that we have formed our identities on. What does it mean to be an American, right? An American, there's a lot of deep commitment to certain principles of equality, principles of freedom, and so on and so forth. And to show how, okay, we're committed to these principles, and yet here's the reality, you have to choose. And not a lot of people are going to say, I want to choose for my comfort and the principles be damned. Not many people are willing to come out and say that. That's the way I approach it. And another way is when I can, and this is it's difficult when you have, a class where you've got predominantly white students and just 2 or maybe 3 students of color. How can you, it's difficult to arrange that class so that the students of color get their story and perspective heard, but not in a way where you're like putting them on stage, right? But as an organic part of the class process. It's trickier when you've got that, but when I rejoice when I have a class, it's like, 1/3, maybe half students of color, because then I know I just have to put the questions out there and get the conversations going. And if I've got a balance in the groups, then people of color's voices will be heard. And I know that's transformative because I've heard it from the students themselves. But it depends upon having, when students of color are such a minority, then I worry. I just recently in one class, there's initial classes were formed into groups of 3, and there was one woman of African descent with one white woman and one white guy, and I was watching the dynamics, and I didn't like what I was seeing. I just thought, this does not look like a pattern that is going to be nourishing or supportive for this woman of color. And so I redid the groups in the hope, because I tend to I form groups in a random fashion, right? I really try to randomize it, but I did it again with larger groups in the hope that she wouldn't end up with those 2 people who I just wasn't confident they were ever going to listen to her, just by the body language I was observing in the group, right? And even then, you can see that, just through body language. You can see, it's like you walk up, you've got a group of 3, one person's a person of color, you 2 are having a conversation, right? And here would be the person of color kind of on the outside of the conversation. You got to pay attention to that, right? And that happens. And then you got to find a way to fix that without just saying, oh, you racist, you're not talking with this person of color. That doesn't work very well. So that's how I respond initially to what you had, your question. Anything else?